This video is a comparison of three Great Mosques from around the world. The first is the Great Mosque of Isfahan in Iran. It's a Shia mosque and one that is so incredibly full of Persian identity and things that are indicative of Persian art and architecture. The clearest example of this Persian art style is found in the color scheme. The four Iwans of Isfahan are all covered in a light blue and gold color scheme. It dominates the Makarnas of the Qibla wall and the geometric and floral patterns that line the colonnades of the courtyard. This color scheme is also mirrored and reflected in the blue water in the center of the courtyard space. This brilliant blue color predates the arrival of Islam in Iran. It's found in pre-Islamic pottery, in multiple examples both within the region and exported out. This is also the origin of blue patterns on china. That kind of brilliant blue was copied by later Han Dynasty China from earlier Persian pottery. So this kind of blue color is indicative of Persian identity, Persian culture that predates Islam. It's also a continuity, not just the blue, but this larger color scheme of blues and golds and kind of watercolor purples. A perfect example of this is the folio of a court of Gayumars from the Shahnameh, which was created after Islam arrived in Iran, but is a continuity in that the Shahnameh is a story of powerful Persian kings and that kind of line of Persian kings. And so this is a book that's been reproduced as a retelling of Persian history and Persian culture throughout time. So while this specific folio is from after Islam's arrival, it is likely a recreation, or at least based on folios that predate the arrival of Islam. Anyway, it's obvious when looking at the color scheme of this beautiful folio and the architecture of Isfahan, the similarities in aesthetic value that Persian culture assigns to light pastels and golds, and the way that those two colors fit together to create a uniquely Persian aesthetic is manifested in both the Court of Gayumars and the Great Mosque of Isfahan. Isfahan is a 4-Iwan plan. These 4 Iwans surround a central courtyard. That courtyard has a pool of water in the shape of a flower. This focus on water as a life-giving force and the courtyard space are continuities that we will see in the other 2 mosques today and generally in mosque architecture around the world. Isfahan is notably missing a hypostyle hall, which we will find in the other 2 mosques we look at today. So there are pieces of the Isfahan mosque architecture that are deeply tied to Islamic mosque tradition, like the 4-Iwan plan, which is so common, and the courtyard. But this color scheme and the immediate visual impact of this mosque are more so tied to pre-Islamic Persian culture than they are to mosque architecture as a whole. The second mosque we're going to look at is the Great Mosque of Cordoba in Spain. Cordoba's plan is also dominated by a courtyard, although it's not in the center. There's a courtyard and a hypostyle, which was largely expanded over 3 stages of development of the mosque. It's also important to notice when you look at the Great Mosque of Cordoba that you are not looking only at a mosque. You are looking at a present-day cathedral, because after the reconquest of Spain, the Spanish monarchy put a cathedral on top. So there's this kind of clunky connection to a Gothic cathedral that's put on top of the hypostyle. When we look only at the original hypostyle, the most obvious and beautiful features are the horseshoe arches, which have alternating orangish red and yellow blocks, and are found in 2 layers, so there is an arch on top of an arch. This is especially notable because Roman architecture on the Iberian Peninsula, fairly close to Cordoba, shows this same stacked horseshoe arches. So they're very similar in structure to what we see later on in Cordoba, which, similar to Isfahan, shows a continuity from pre-Islamic architecture, dominating the creation of mosque architecture in this specific location. So appealing to a pre-existing sense of Spanish identity and fusing that with Islam. The other way in which we see a fusion in Cordoba is, again, in the color scheme. These oranges and yellows are seen in folios and architectural spaces before and after Islam's arrival in Spain. So the color scheme is a uniquely Spanish one. The arches are related to Roman buildings on the peninsula, and on the Qibla wall we see the representation of this horseshoe arch done in bright, bright golds that remind us almost of Byzantine architecture with this kind of gold inlay. So there's a focus on reds and oranges and golds that's uniquely Spanish, and that's manifested here on the Qibla wall, in the same way that we see those blues and golds on the Makarnas and the Qibla wall in Isfahan. So there's a fusion of an architectural feature that is necessarily Islamic. Its goal is to show you what direction to pray in, with a pre-existing cultural aesthetic that we see in both mosques. Similar to Isfahan, when we look at the plan of Cordoba, it is fairly obvious at first that this is a mosque. We have a large courtyard space, which has now been filled with orange groves, but originally was a more traditional courtyard space, like we see at the Alhambra. And we have this focus on water and on life-giving in that courtyard space, and also in the way that light filters through the building. The clerestory lighting that we find in the hypostyle shows light filtering in to create a separate, sacred, transcendent space, which is common in lots of Islamic architecture around the world. So we have these things that are clearly tied to Islamic identity, but also aspects that are from pre-existing cultures that fuse to create something incredibly unique at Cordoba, and that is altered yet again when you take into consideration that this is no longer a mosque. The third mosque in this video is the Great Mosque of Janneh in Mali. It's obvious when you first see this that it is very different from the other two we're looking at. This visual distinction is created by the fact that this is a mosque made of mud brick. Now, we don't have very many mud brick buildings around, for a very clear reason. They don't stay very long, they don't last, which is why Janneh is so fascinating. It does start to fade and fall apart with the rains. Every year, we see this mosque begin to slide and deteriorate, because it is made of mud, and it's not as sturdy as the other building materials that we see in our everyday life. In Mali, especially in Janneh, we have mud brick buildings that have been continuously rebuilt by the families who live there every year as it rains, to maintain entire mud brick houses and structures and marketplaces. And the Great Mosque of Janneh fits very clearly into that identity of mud brick architecture in Mali. It has to be rebuilt every year by the community, but that adds to its power. It is created and rebuilt by community strength and community power. It necessitates involvement, which is what every mosque's goal is. Janneh is just dependent on the love and continuous support and visitation of its community in a more literal way than other mosques. So because it is continuously rebuilt by the community, this has taken on a sort of ritual component that would seem foreign to most Muslims around the world, but in Mali is part of this very specific pre-Islamic architectural style and also way of life that is dependent on continuous rebuilding and effort and work. So the Great Mosque of Janneh fuses ritual with purpose and architecture with purpose in a way that we don't see as much in the other two mosques. Its plan, however, is very similar to the plan of Cordoba. It has a hypostyle and a large courtyard, so it's very similar in its basic plan to Cordoba. However, that hypostyle obviously looks very different because it is mud brick. So we have these wooden pillars and spikes that stick out to kind of hold the rest of the building in place, that create this uniquely West African and uniquely Malian identity for this building. So again, there's this fusion of larger Islamic building trends with very localized building trends. And in this way, all three mosques are a metaphor for the diversity of the Islamic community, not just of their art, not just of their mosque architecture, but the way that they bring pre-existing culture to the table, and that doesn't make it less Islamic, it makes it true of who they are and what their culture represents. So Islamic Spanish architecture looks like other Spanish architecture, but with very specific points of inflection that are unique to Islam and that we find in all three of these mosques. So this focus on the desert, this hypostyle into courtyard in all three, and Qibla wall in all three are created by the necessities of ritualized practice in Islam, but still look very different depending on the way that you practice and the way that you bring your pre-existing culture to the table. So Islamic architecture looks very different depending on where you are in the world, and that hasn't changed with modernity. But the Islamic community also looks very different based on where you are in the world, and that doesn't make it necessarily divided, but it does make it diverse. And so acknowledging that Islam is not one pure continuous form, but something that changes and evolves with specific roots that it's very aware of, is true for both Islamic architecture and Islam as a whole.